After I died, half a year passed before my son finally escaped from the clutches of Johnny's lover. He called his father, only to be met with scorn. Half a year without coming home, and the first thing you say on the phone is your mother's dead. Is this a new trick she taught you? Quickly, let her talk to me, and tell her I'm very angry. My son tried desperately to explain, to seek help, but Johnny coldly hung up the phone. It wasn't until he saw his son, emaciated and covered in bruises, that Johnny realized the truth. With tears in his eyes, he hugged his son and said, "You have to be good from now on. Your mother will become a star in the sky watching over you." My son pushed him away blankly. "Mom won't become a star because you can see the stars. But Mom never wants to see you again." After my death, my son Joshua was taken away by Betty. For 6 months, Betty relentlessly tortured my son, unleashing all her suppressed mental illness on him. I was angry but helpless. Until one day, Betty received an invitation from Johnny. After showing off in front of the downtrodden Joshua, she happily went on the date. Following the advice of a ghostly sister nearby, I used the energy I had saved up to open the door. "Hurry, go, call the police," I said, feeling a sudden weakness throughout my body. My entire body became translucent. The ghostly sister told me that ghosts need to exchange their energy to affect reality. The longer a ghost has been dead, the higher their energy. As a ghost of 6 months, using it up now could mean total dispersion. "Mom, is that you?" Joshua heard my voice and his battered face lit up with surprise. Unfortunately, I couldn't respond to him. An hour later, he borrowed a phone from a kind student on the roadside, but to my surprise, he didn't call the police. Instead, he called Johnny. "Dad, I've been kidnapped by Betty, and Mom has passed away. Can you come get me?" Johnny interrupted his son, scolding, "Half a year without coming home, and the first thing you say on the phone is your mother's dead. Is this a new trick she taught you? Quickly, let her talk to me, and tell her I'm very angry." Joshua cried, insisting he wasn't lying, that his mother was really gone. "Enough." Johnny's voice came impatiently. "Enough of this. If you want to come back quickly. I don't have time to listen to your lies." The next moment, the call ended, leaving my son staring blankly at the disconnected phone. Seeing his distress, my heart ached, praying for him to quickly make an emergency call. "Can I, sister?" Joshua began, but suddenly, a voice came from behind him. "Hey kid." At first, it sounded like Betty, but when I turned to look, it wasn't her, just a similar voice. Joshua's eyes widened, and he, in a panic, returned the phone to the student and ran off without looking back. In just 6 months, Betty had driven him to the brink. The student watched the son run off, feeling the urge to help, but was advised by a companion to contact his dad first. Dialing the number, the student didn't get a chance to speak before Johnny's voice came through, scolding, "Stop these antics. I've said I won't fall for them. If you don't want to come back, then never come back." He then abruptly hung up. The student, looking distressed, now with no sign of Joshua, muttered to the companion, "What kind of dad is that?" Joshua dashed out from the crowd, and as cursing voices trailed him, criticizing his appearance and questioning if he carried any viruses, I floated above him, furious. "My son is not a beggar," I yelled. Joshua ran to the bridge's arch, looking back to ensure Betty wasn't following him before leaning against the stone wall to catch his breath. His breaths grew rapid, face flushing red, drenched in sweat. His asthma was acting up. With no medicine, he could only lean against the wall, struggling to breathe. Tears welled up in my eyes as I watched Joshua endure the hardship. When he slightly recovered, he stood up abruptly, looking around and asking, "Mom? I miss you, Mom." I choked out a response, but he couldn't hear me. "Mom, I've escaped, so don't worry about me. But I don't want to go home. Dad is a bad person, just like Betty. I never want to see Dad again." I reached out to hug him, but my hands passed through his body again and again. As night fell and Joshua fell asleep, I went to Johnny, hoping he could bring back Joshua. At 11, Johnny, dressed neatly, sat on the couch, fiddling with a jade bracelet, his slender fingers weaving in and out, back and forth. I looked at the bracelet in his hand with mixed feelings. I found this bracelet while cleaning the study one day. In university, I took a few courses on jewelry appreciation and immediately recognized it as an antique. Johnny once mentioned giving the family heirloom bracelet to his future wife. I had been waiting for him to give it to me, but 5 years passed, and Johnny never brought the subject up. He knew about me finding the bracelet in the drawer while cleaning, so I thought it was meant for me to take. Happy, I went to find Johnny but was met with his request to return the bracelet, without any explanation. It wasn't until I mentioned Betty's name that his face changed dramatically. We argued, and before leaving the house, I hugged Joshua. It was then we encountered the accident. I breathed deeply, trying to push away the fear of that day and focused my attention back on Johnny. I've been dead for half a year, and you still haven't given this bracelet to Betty? The butler said to Johnny, "Sir, nearly the entire city has been searched, but we still haven't found our lady and young master. Should we send more people out to search?" Grasping the bracelet tightly, Johnny asked, "Are you sure you've searched everywhere?" "Yes, sir, everywhere we could." Johnny's expression darkened. I had a moment of astonishment when I heard the conversation between the two of them. It felt like I had traveled back 5 years ago, when Betty hadn't returned to Johnny yet. Back then, we had fewer misunderstandings and he still cared about me. As my thoughts drifted away, Johnny's phone rang, and when he saw it was Betty calling, he immediately answered. "Did you say you saw Tina a few days ago?" Betty's voice came through the phone. "Yeah, I saw her a week ago with Joshua shopping outside. I went up to talk to her but she ignored me. I thought she had already gone back." "Why hasn't she gone back yet?" Listening to this, I sneered. Betty's skill at fabricating facts to sow discord was becoming more sophisticated. I'd been dead for half a year, where would I take Joshua shopping? Unfortunately, Johnny believed it, his knuckles turning white as he coldly replied, "She hasn't come back." Betty said, "Tina is being a bit too stubborn, but Joshua is only 5, and he needs his parents' company at this age. Johnny, don't worry too much. When she's done playing around, she'll definitely go back." Johnny angrily said, "Whether she wants to go back or not, it doesn't matter if she stays outside for another 6 months. Don't be angry, Tina definitely cares about you." Johnny remained silent with a stern face. On Betty's end, she said, "By the way, have you seen the diamond necklace you gave me before? I want to use it, but I can't find it." After thinking for a moment, Johnny pulled out a gorgeous necklace from his suit jacket and said, "It's in my coat pocket. I'll send it to you." "No need, I'll come and get it tomorrow." Betty excitedly declined, but Johnny insisted on going. The call ended, and I coldly looked at the necklace in his hand. If I remember correctly, this necklace was the one I once asked Johnny for. Back then, Johnny looked at the picture and even complimented how pretty it was. I thought he would give it to May and never thought it ended up in Betty's hands. Johnny got up to leave, and the butler asked, "Sir, should we still send someone to look? Madam and Master haven't had any news for half a year. What if something happens?" Johnny was momentarily dazed by this question, then said in a deep voice, "No, let them all come back." "But sir..." Johnny interrupted him, rebuking, "Can't you understand what I'm saying?" The butler was silenced by Johnny's words and didn't dare to say anything more. Johnny sneered, "Dead? Even if everyone in the world is dead, Tina will still be fine. Playing such a low trick, thinking I would fall for it? Ridiculous." With that, he turned and walked quickly towards the door. Johnny quickly made his way to Betty's house. Betty, sweating profusely, opened the door. "Why are you sweating so much?" Johnny asked. "Just tidying up the house, please come in quickly." Betty led Johnny inside. I floated above their heads, immediately looking towards the room where Joshua had been imprisoned for half a year, only to find it locked. I felt a mixture of resentment and irony. So Betty was sweating profusely, full of guilt, because she wanted to hide the evidence of her misdeeds before Johnny arrived. At the moment of my death, Betty had appeared at the scene of the incident. My consciousness was fuzzy, but I could clearly feel the pain. It hurt, my whole body hurt. Betty appeared in front of me in high heels. I reached out to her, begging her to check on Joshua's condition. Betty pushed me away and dragged Joshua out from under me. "Help, Betty, save him." I couldn't make a sound, my ears felt like they were filled with water, and I could barely hear the muffled voices, my vision even turning blood red. Betty checked on Joshua's condition and then took out my phone from my body. "Johnny just called you, but I accidentally hung up. You won't blame me, will you?" Betty smiled and said, "But you don't have a chance anymore if you want to blame me, do it in the next life. As for your son, don't worry, I'll take good care of him." And then, she kept Joshua locked up and abused him for a whole 6 months. As my breathing became heavy, the fear of impending death and the hatred towards Betty for abusing Joshua made my chest feel like it was about to explode. I wanted to strangle her right away. Johnny looked around the room. "Why does the room look so different?" Betty nervously changed the subject. "Just felt like tidying up, please have a seat." Johnny handed the necklace in his pocket to Betty, and she took it, exclaiming, "I've been looking for this for so long, luckily you helped me put it away." The diamond necklace sparkled under the light, reflecting dazzling light on Betty's face. Looking at the necklace in Betty's hand, I suddenly remembered the 4-leaf clover platinum necklace I had 4 years ago. That was the necklace Betty had brought to me. "A platinum necklace. Johnny is really good to you. He's even willing to buy you a platinum necklace." It pained me to see the price tag on it, thinking it would cost him half a month's salary. But the fact that it was a gift from Johnny made me happy again. It was our first wedding anniversary. I was halfway through expressing my joy when I suddenly noticed the necklace around Betty's neck. It was no different from the one in my hand. She seemed to notice my distraction, looked down at the necklace on her neck, and said with a smile, "Johnny said he was grateful for helping him pick out the anniversary gift, and I thought Johnny worked too hard usually, so I chose the most suitable one based on the price." The feeling of joy suddenly dissipated. I expressionlessly put the necklace back into the box, never looking at it again. Really? That day, when Johnny came back, it was the first time we argued because of Betty. After that, Johnny gave me many gifts, but never another piece of jewelry and the necklace I wanted, he had given to Betty. I still remember the name of that necklace, called Only One Heart. But I have never been Johnny's only one. "It's okay, just don't lose it next time," Johnny said, taking off his coat, and in the process, a jade green bracelet almost fell to the ground. I watched coldly as Betty grabbed the bracelet and then asked in a sincere tone, "You didn't give this bracelet to Tina?" Johnny's expression was somewhat stunned, and after a moment of silence, he said, "No, I didn't." Betty's eyes immediately turned red. "Would you still be willing to give this bracelet to me?" "I didn't mean anything else. I know you are married and should give it to Tina. It's just, this is our past memory, it's also my youth." Of course, Betty is Johnny's youth. Or rather, Johnny's many years of obsession. When I met Johnny, a colleague informed me. Johnny had a first love, and the two had agreed to get married right after college if it weren't for Betty's parents divorcing, forcing Betty to leave the city, causing the two to lose contact. They probably would have had children together. And Johnny remained single from college to work, just to wait for his first love, Betty, to come back to him. But at that time, I was too involved to pay attention to this. I even said, "Cry once from an ex and the current one will lose." I didn't believe in rekindling old flames and reunions. But the subsequent developments were cruel and profound, and made me realize I had to believe. The bracelet that Johnny wouldn't let me touch was probably meant to be given to Betty at some point. Thinking about this, I suddenly heard Johnny say, "I'm sorry, Betty. I have decided to give the bracelet to Tina." Not only Betty was stunned, I was stunned too. And then I felt somewhat ironic. It's too late. I'm already dead. I need to go to the restroom. Johnny stood up and said. Betty immediately stood up and followed him with tears in her eyes. Johnny glanced at the room locked beside the restroom, puzzled, and asked, "Why is it locked?" At this point, Betty was too upset to cry, her breathing slightly accelerated, then casually said, "My dog went missing before, I couldn't find it, looking at this room made me sad, so I just locked it up." Hearing this, I wished I could go up and tear Betty's mouth apart. My son is not your pet dog. Johnny nodded and then said, have you searched thoroughly? Do you want me to accompany you to look for it later? Betty declined, no need, you're busy with work, I can't bother you anymore. Besides, Tina hasn't been found, you surely can't split your attention. Johnny fell silent. Betty glanced at Johnny, worriedly said, the weather is getting colder now. Johnny's expression darkened. Of course, I understood why he suddenly became gloomy. Because 3 years ago, when I took Joshua to the park to play on the slide, I answered a phone call midway, and when I came back, Joshua had an asthma attack and at that time, it was Betty who found out. When Johnny arrived, seeing Joshua all sweaty, he immediately accused me of being careless and unworthy of being a mother. I felt both guilty and heartbroken. That night when I was giving Joshua a bath, I said we should be grateful to Betty for saving Joshua. Joshua, in a daze, said, Mom, annoying. At that time, I thought Joshua was referring to me, but now I think about it. Joshua is not the type to break a sweat just playing on a slide, right? Unfortunately, over the years, the image of me in Johnny's mind has deteriorated, he simply doesn't believe my reasoning. He's convinced that I'm just trying to shift the blame. I could only try to guard against Betty, but alas, after I died, Joshua was still taken away by Betty. Suddenly, Johnny suggested leaving. Betty immediately asked, aren't you staying for a while longer? No, Johnny picked up his coat and turned to leave, looking somewhat gloomy. Betty stood behind Johnny, her expression uncertain. Just looking at her expression made me want to kill. For the past 6 months, every time Betty showed this kind of expression, Joshua would end up with a few more cigarette burns on his body. When Johnny returned to the villa with a dark face, he unreasonably snapped at the servants. Tension filled the atmosphere of the villa. At this moment, a servant came forward holding a broken wooden carving, asking, Sir, we found this when cleaning the storage room, it's broken, is it important? I looked at it and was once again stunned. The wooden carving was decapitated, covered in dust, but one could still vaguely see the rough and clumsy carving lines. This was the first birthday gift I gave to Johnny. I carved it for 3 days, my hands full of cuts, and when I carefully handed it to Johnny, he carelessly lifted an eyelid, sneered, its ugly eye was embarrassed and angry, thinking that if Johnny didn't accept it, I would never make him gifts again, and I wouldn't like him anymore. In anticipation, Johnny took my wood carving and commented, only you can make something so ugly. But his tone didn't sound disdainful at all. Later, no matter where he was, he could see the wood carving. Johnny had a crush on me, but he didn't love me the most. I knew that the moment he angrily broke the wood carving because of an argument with Betty. Doesn't matter, Johnny said coldly. Yes, why would my things matter anyway? The servant asked, should I throw it away? Yes, discard it, Johnny said without hesitation. The servant turned to comply. Suddenly, Johnny called her back. Stop. The servant turned back in surprise. After a long silence, Johnny finally said, give it to me. He took the wood carving upstairs and clumsily glued it back together. He stood there in silence gazing at the wood carving, lost in his thoughts. I didn't care to know what he was thinking. Betty called Johnny again and invited him to a 5-star Michelin restaurant for her birthday tomorrow. Johnny hesitated for a moment, then agreed. Birthday. Yes, tomorrow is also Joshua's birthday. As the door was knocked, the servant came in carrying a steaming bowl of porridge. Sir, you didn't eat much tonight. The kitchen prepared this porridge for you, following the instructions given by the madam. Please have some. Johnny looked at the porridge in the servant's hand, remained silent for a while, and declined, I don't want it, take it away. The servant felt awkward, looking at Johnny with concern, but sir? I said take it away, and don't bring it to me again, Johnny sternly ordered. The servant had no choice but to obey. Watching the servant holding the fish porridge, I felt a pang of heartache. Johnny liked eating fish, but I had always avoided killing. However, once Johnny mentioned he liked fish porridge, I suppressed my aversion to make it for him. Later, fearing Johnny might miss dinner after work, I taught the servant how to make fish porridge. But now seeing Johnny's indifferent attitude, I realized I had been deluding myself. After spending a while with Johnny, I tried to leave a message with Joshua's ashes, but I was too weak to do so. I didn't want to witness Johnny and Betty's affectionate behavior, so I decided to leave and go back to Joshua. In the early hours of the morning, Joshua woke up several times, his face pale, clutching his stomach tightly, rummaging through the trash can for food. After finding a half-eaten bowl of cold noodles, he muttered, "Can't finish it all, need to save some for tomorrow, or there won't be anything left to eat." Seeing Joshua like this, I felt unbearably heartbroken and could only cry in sorrow. I hated Betty even more for causing all this and felt it was so unfair that carefully cooked fish porridge prepared by the servant was left untouched by Johnny, while Joshua had to search the trash can for food to fill his empty stomach. I watched him in unbearable pain, feeling helpless. Joshua had a restless night, waking up multiple times. The last time he saw a passerby carrying a cake, he didn't sleep thereafter. He sat on the ground, staring blankly at the cake, murmuring the words he heard from the passerby, September 3 RD. "Mom, is today Joshua's birthday?" He remembered. I cried, unable to bear this scene. Joshua took out the half bowl of noodles he had hidden in the stone cave, then clasped his hands solemnly, as if making a wish. He hoped his mother in heaven would be happy. Afterward, wiping away his tears, Joshua held the noodles, somewhat defiantly saying, "Since Dad doesn't want me, I won't wish him a happy birthday either." A 5-year-old child doesn't understand hate yet. Not wishing his dad a happy birthday is the biggest revenge he knows. I couldn't bear to witness this anymore. I immediately went towards Johnny. Johnny and Betty happened to be leaving, walking towards the restaurant. Champagne, roses, music, gourmet food. Waiters brought out exquisite and magnificent dishes. Johnny held the cutlery but didn't eat much before asking the waiter to clear the table. Betty spoke, "Are you thinking about Joshua? After all, today is also Joshua's birthday." Johnny remained silent. Betty smiled, a hint of schadenfreude in her eyes. Joshua must be having a good time with Tina today. Unable to bear it any longer, I slapped Betty. She seemed unfazed. Johnny seemed to have some opinions. It's okay on other days, but today, not even a phone call. Then why don't you call her and ask about Joshua? I saw a fleeting look of malice in Joshua's eyes. After a moment of silence, Johnny picked up his phone and called me. From the ringing tone to the natural disconnection, Johnny's face darkened. He tried a few more times, but no one answered. How could I answer? My belongings had been taken care of by Betty. Taking a deep breath, suppressing the chilling fear of dying, I looked at Johnny. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual, just gripping his cutlery tightly with a grim expression. Betty tactfully intervened, "Perhaps she's busy. Try calling her later tonight." "She has blocked me," Johnny said. In front of Betty, he would openly discuss the daily conflicts between us. He once claimed his conscience was clear. I believed it was more like overconfidence. Johnny's grandiloquent words juxtaposed with Betty's superficial performance. Joshua unknowingly wandered back to his front door. He recognized his home but stood there frozen. It wasn't until the neighbor next door, Mary, came out of her villa and saw Joshua that she yelled in disgust, "Where did this little beggar come from? How did you get in here?" "Wait, you're Joshua." Mary recognized Joshua and her face was filled with disbelief. "Joshua, how did you end up like this? Where's your mom?" When Joshua mentioned his mom, his eyes immediately welled up. "My mom, she's dead." Mary gasped, "Your mom was still so young." Tears streamed down Joshua's face, and Mary quickly urged him, "Joshua, I don't know what happened to you too, but now that you're home, go inside quickly. Your dad must be worried sick about you. He doesn't care about me." Joshua snapped angrily. Mary was puzzled but continued to persuade Joshua to go back home. Seeing her earnest efforts to convince Joshua, I felt especially grateful to her. I made up my mind to repay her kindness in the next life. Joshua was hesitant at first but eventually began to waver. Nervously, he looked at Mary and asked, "Mary, will my dad really be worried about me?" Of course, he's your dad, he definitely cares about you, Mary assured him. I stood by, encouraging Mary silently, hoping she could persuade Joshua to go back home quickly. After a moment of hesitation, Joshua finally nodded heavily and said, I'll go back now. Mary beamed with joy, waving at him as he walked away. I wanted to thank her but suddenly noticed Betty behind her. My expression changed instantly, and I rushed to Joshua, only to find him crouched by a fountain nearby, washing his face carefully. My eyes welled up with tears. Was Joshua really worried that Johnny wouldn't recognize him? Betty's voice came from behind. Mary, why are you so happy? Is something good happening? Mary sounded proud as she replied, nothing much, just saw Joshua from next door. The kid has gone through some changes and turned into a beggar, didn't want to go back home. But I managed to convince him. Betty gasped, what? Then she trembled, really? When did Joshua come back? Just now, isn't he over there? Mary pointed towards Joshua's figure. Betty was about to approach when I, feeling nervous and fearful, followed closely behind Joshua. Glancing back at Johnny, who had already left the yard, I could see he had noticed Joshua's figure as well, frowning deeply where he stood. This child? Mary immediately asked, do you think it's Joshua? But Joshua was with Tina, how could he have turned into a beggar? Hearing Mary's words, I stomped my foot in frustration. Joshua was right there, why didn't Johnny go and confirm? Surprisingly, Johnny ignored Betty's words, his face stern as he stepped out of the yard and headed towards Joshua's direction. Meanwhile, Betty was stomping her foot angrily, glaring at Joshua before turning and running away. I knew she was trying to escape, but I couldn't stop her. Joshua sensed someone approaching from behind, panicked, and turned around. His face, already dark, filled with fear in his eyes. At just a glance, Johnny turned pale. Joshua, Joshua. Johnny rushed forward, grabbing Joshua, his face full of disbelief, voice trembling as he asked, Joshua, how did you end up like this? Don't touch me. Joshua screamed, struggling and even trying to bite him. Tearfully, Johnny cautiously reached out to touch Joshua's face, his voice choked, Joshua, I'm your dad, where's your mom? Tears streaming, Joshua kicked at him, screaming, Mom's dead, Mom's dead. It's impossible. Johnny raised his voice angrily, she can't be dead. This must be a scam. You and your mom must be scamming me, right? Those wounds on you are fake, right? Reaching out, he touched the wounds on his son's body, causing Joshua to cry out in pain, tears flowing continuously. You're a bad person. You're all bad people just like Betty. That's enough. I know you planned this with your mom to deceive me. Johnny, his face white, stared at the bleeding wounds on his son, his voice trembling, your mom must be nearby, she must be. He stood up, holding Joshua, his eyes turning red, filled with anger and suppression, constantly searching our figures around him, shouting, Mary. I know you're here, come out quickly, I'm already angry. My mom is dead. Joshua screamed and cried. Joshua's nose was red, his expression filled with despair and sorrow, tears streaming down his face. My mom died a long time ago. Johnny's body swayed for a moment, his face pale, murmuring, impossible, how could she possibly leave you behind and me as well? Johnny brought Joshua home to care for him. Joshua was very repulsed by his touch, showing clear disdain. Johnny was deeply hurt by Joshua's rejection, but there was nothing he could do to change it. The butler reported to Johnny every day about the search for my whereabouts. Each time the butler said they couldn't find me, Johnny would fly into a rage. Perhaps the lady really shut up. Johnny sharply reprimanded, veins bulging on his forehead, staring fiercely at the butler, saying, I don't want to hear that word. How could she be dead? It's impossible. The servants in the villa remained silent, not daring to speak. Johnny gritted his teeth, his jaw clenched tightly, and continued, keep searching for her, you must find them all. Betty had escaped. Johnny was becoming frantic trying to find her. Even now, perhaps in Johnny's mind, the desire to find answers from Betty was stronger, wasn't it? I don't know how to describe the scene before my eyes, slipping past Johnny's side by supporting myself. But the next moment, Johnny suddenly turned in my direction. His lips trembled, his pupils flickering, tears actually moistening his eyes. Johnny disliked me so much. How could he sense my presence? How could he cry because of me? 3 weeks after Betty's escape, she was caught. Johnny went to the police station immediately. I followed. Betty looked haggard, clothes tattered. Johnny looked grim, stubbly, and when they sat face to face, it was hard to tell who the fugitive was. Betty, Johnny's voice hoarse, staring at Betty, asked, "Where is Tina?" When Betty heard Johnny's question, she first froze, then burst into laughter. "Dead. I don't believe it. Dead, she died half a year ago. I don't believe it." Johnny became furious. He grabbed Betty, hateful, and asked, "Where did you hide her? Where did you hide her?" Betty was gasping for breath. The nearby policeman rushed forward to stop Johnny, pressing him against the table. Johnny's eyes were red, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Where did you hide my Tina?" Betty gasped for breath, looking at Johnny with hatred, sneering. "I said, she died half a year ago. So shut up, I don't believe you." "Don't believe?" Betty sneered. "It's you who doesn't believe, whether it was the flirty texts I sent her before, hinting we were having an affair, or when I purposely chose a necklace like hers to provoke her. Either way, she told you, and you didn't believe seriously. You really satisfied me." Johnny trembling all over. "Unbelievable. Oh, by the way, did Mary call you before she died?" "Call?" Johnny looked puzzled. Betty smiled. "Yes, that was a life-saving call. She wanted you by her side." Johnny's face lost all color, staring blankly at Betty. "I still have a photo of her when she died. Do you want to see it? All crushed by a car, so pitiful." Johnny's eyes red, roaring and struggling like an angry beast. "Betty, I'm going to kill you." The police took Betty away from the interrogation room, Johnny angrily struggling against the police, constantly shouting that he would kill Betty, that he would find me. But I was already dead. Johnny's state after returning from the police station was very bad. He began to neglect himself, sitting in his room all day, his temper becoming more erratic. Initially, I thought he was just unable to handle the shock, but one day when I drifted into his room, I saw him affectionately kissing the wooden carving I had given him, tears streaming down his face. "Tina, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. It's my fault, I'm sorry." Johnny sobbed hoarsely, full of regret and pain. I watched him coldly, without any hint of wavering in my heart. Johnny was despondent all day long, and one day he fell down the stairs, breaking his leg. The servants rushed to send him to the hospital. But he said, Don't worry about me." No one cared about Tina at the time. Tears streamed down his increasingly gaunt face, his eyes dull and desolate, holding the wooden carving I gave him as if treasuring it, suddenly laughing and saying, "Tina, let's not stay in the hospital, let's go home, okay?" The medical staff around exchanged looks, seemingly doubtful about Johnny's condition. Ignoring the medical staff's dissuasion, Johnny insisted on going home. Then he locked himself in his room, refusing to eat or drink. After being despondent for many days, he suddenly asked for fish porridge. But despite the servants making many portions, he was dissatisfied with all, saying it didn't taste right. The servants, feeling uneasy, finally dared to say, "We made it according to Mrs. Tina's recipe. She's not here now." "Shut up." Johnny cut off the servant's words, speaking viciously. "She is still here." He muttered to himself, "She's not dead, she's always here." The servants looked at each other in bewilderment and eventually called a doctor to diagnose him. Johnny was mentally disturbed. He seemed to be insane yet lucid. He often talked to himself, speaking to the air. The doctor could only go along with Johnny for the time being, then treat him gently. Johnny was stabilized, but after a few days, he started rummaging through pockets, searching for something, appearing extremely irritable, as if on the brink of collapse. The butler quickly stepped forward and asked, "Sir, what's wrong? Where is my diamond necklace? Give it to Betty. Tell her that I've confirmed Tina as my wife, give her the bracelet, and give the necklace to Betty. Tell her I've decided to cut ties." Johnny concocted a lie in his mind. A lie that I was still jealous, ran away from home, and was hiding somewhere refusing to see him. The butler looked somewhat distressed, then said, "Okay, I'll do it right away." Johnny then asked, "Has the lady not come back yet?" "Joshua is starting school." The butler had no words. Johnny turned to the butler and asked, "When is the lady coming back?" "I just need an answer, or he would explode," continuously breaking things. The butler remained silent. Johnny angrily slammed the door and entered his room. After a few weeks, Betty's trial result came out. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison for illegal detention and abuse. Johnny was very dissatisfied with this result. He immediately smashed a chair in court, angrily shouting that it was unfair. Betty gave Johnny a triumphant glance, then followed the prison guard out. Johnny wanted to chase after her, but was held back tightly by someone. He could only watch with red eyes as Betty left. After the police brought Johnny back home, he stopped eating and drinking again. But this time, he started acting strangely. He spent his days researching roads and streets, even calling in a lawyer to set up a trust fund, planning something. Finally, on the day Betty was being taken to prison, Johnny drove a truck and crashed into Betty. Betty died on the spot. Johnny was also seriously injured and admitted to the hospital. After recovering from his injuries, he was sentenced to death for the murder. On the day of his conviction, he broke free from the police's grip, found Joshua, and tearfully hugged him. "You have to be good from now on. Mom and Dad will become stars in the sky, watching over you together." His son, expressionless, pushed him away. "Mom won't become a star because the stars can be seen by you. But she never wants to see you again." Johnny was frozen in shock. The police took him away, and he gazed back at Joshua with a look of despair in his eyes. My figure was becoming increasingly transparent. I had reached my limit. Reluctant to look back at Joshua, I waited to fade away completely. But an unbelievable voice came through, and I turned my head to see Johnny. Trembling, he tried to reach out to touch me, but passed straight through my body. Tina, you've always been here." "I'm sorry, it's all my fault, it was always my fault. I have hurt you. It's all me." Johnny cried and sobbed, his expression full of remorse and pain. Exhausted, I closed my eyes. I vanished in Johnny's desperate wails. "Johnny, you're no longer my love." After Johnny's death, the butler took Joshua to collect the ashes, following Johnny's last wish to be buried with Betty's remains. Joshua, holding the ashes, coldly opened the lid, scooped up the remains, and let them scatter in the wind in front of the astonished butler. He didn't deserve it. And in a corner beside Joshua, a man with a pallid face growing increasingly transparent, looked more and more desperate.